Well, it's a very warm welcome to everyone on our second webinar this morning. In our series of unpacking the blockchain and crypto assets. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Liz. I'm a director in our legal practice area, focusing on corporate commercial work, mergers and acquisitions, and Black economic empowerment transactions. This morning, I'm very lucky. I'm joined by my colleague, Thilin Pillay. He's a director in our risk advisory practice area. And for those of you who attended our webinar last month, Thilin presented it on really discussing the basics of understanding the blockchain and crypto assets. And he used such terms as distributed ledger, cryptography, decentralized networks, miners, staking, and the Genesis block. And just in going through those terms and listening to him, I felt like if we were living in this type of alternative universe. But those concepts are important, and that presentation kind of forms the basis of our understanding of blockchain and crypto assets. And what I've asked Denise to do this morning is to probably send a copy of that presentation with this one so that you can sort of familiarize yourself again with those terms. So thanks very much for that. Next slide, please, Thilin. I suppose you can skip the slide on the picture of Liz and Thilin. And really what we're going to discuss this morning is a question on whether crypto assets like Bitcoin, and I'll focus on Bitcoin for purposes of this chat, because everyone knows a Bitcoin, is a legitimate asset, and is it capable of being used as legal tender? So today I thought we'd discuss the various legal considerations relating to crypto assets and what it means to you and I. I'll focus on Bitcoin, but anyone who's kind of an ardent follower of crypto assets will know that in South Africa, we have at least 60 different crypto assets. And if you go to a crypto asset service provider, they're called CASPs, which is also quite a cool name, like Valor, you'll see that there's a whole broad spectrum of crypto assets on those websites, on their trading platform. And they've got names like Polkadot and Cello and StormX and Waves. So it's just giving us a real sense of really what this, how developed this crypto asset industry is. But really, can we use Bitcoin to buy something? And can we send our Bitcoin overseas? So anecdotally, I was just chatting to Thilin yesterday. And because we kind of know Bitcoin, and it's the most widely used, spoken about crypto asset, I had a look at what it would have cost us to buy a Bitcoin on 18 November 2021. Now that's at its peak in the last trading period. And if you bought one Bitcoin, if you were lucky enough to have that kind of money, or even a fraction of that Bitcoin, it would have cost you R1,060,000 Rand. And yesterday, when I was preparing for the webinar and I had a look at what a Bitcoin would cost us now, one Bitcoin would cost 392,000 Rand. So it gives you an idea of how volatile and how risky the crypto assets can be. And so you've really got to understand what you're doing when you're investing in them. Next slide, please, Thilin. So what we did, and those of you familiar with kind of crypto assets and the jargon around it, we kind of pulled some sort of brief descriptors in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of describing what a crypto asset is. So how do you eat a Bitcoin? Well, it's 1 megabyte. How do you become a Bitcoin millionaire? Bit by bit. And I like the Bitcoin the same as I like my gold. I like it mined by someone else. So that just gives you the sense of kind of this kind of asset class that we're dealing with. But Thilin, perhaps you can give us a brief description of what your understanding of firstly blockchain is, and then what we mean by a crypto asset, just to kind of refresh ourselves on that.
Thanks, Liz. So I think you started it off quite nicely. And in my previous webinar, we sort of started off by saying the blockchain and cryptocurrency and crypto assets is essentially everything you don't understand about money, combined with everything you don't understand about computers and networks.
Yeah, exactly.
To essentially present you kind of, or present the sort of the average Joe with a perfect storm.
Yeah.
From that perspective. But if we were to maybe just sort of separate it, if people were to just think about, the internet when that sort of first started, and then the email, which was essentially a product of the internet. Cryptocurrencies and crypto assets and digital assets is just one product of a blockchain. A blockchain has many use cases, and there are more and more use cases that is essentially being developed as it becomes a bit more mainstream in various economies, as in certain economies where it's actually used as a legal tender, and I know you're going to be talking about that a little bit later. But I think a good analogy is for people to think about it that way. Think of it as the cryptocurrency, as the blockchain is to the internet, as cryptocurrencies is similar to email in terms of that analogy. But I think if we were to then just break it down, we're looking at the blockchain is essentially, you've got blocks of data, which is, it's time-stamped, it goes in a particular chronological order. It is exactly that. It's a chain reaction of events that has to happen over a period of time. Each block forms a particular piece of work that then moves on into the next block. And throughout that process, it forms this immutable ledger. Now, up until recently, many people obviously thought that it could not be hacked. In fact, the blockchain can be hacked. What it is that it's exceptionally difficult to hack. Because in order to be able to do that, you need to essentially have full control of the blockchain, because you have to be able to manipulate every single block in order to make to essentially make the data sort of transparent and move across the various chains. Otherwise, you're essentially going to have a break in the chain, which is then you're not going to be able to rely upon it. So for someone to be able to hack a blockchain, it is very difficult. It does not mean that it has not been done. It has actually been done in more recent times. Crypto assets, on the other hand, cryptocurrencies is one form of crypto assets. So you've got many different forms of crypto assets. Think about any sort of digital assets and crypto assets that we are looking at in this scenarios. Any type of digital asset that is essentially a product of the blockchain, or that is built upon that is essentially built upon that blockchain. And cryptocurrency is just one form of it. We spoke about in our previous webinar about NFTs, which is non-fungible tokens. You've got various different forms of that, and you are going to be getting those type of digital assets or crypto assets that is essentially going to be on the increase. The idea behind it is that it's essentially transactional data sets that is secured by a particular piece of cryptography that then secures that part of information. But the use cases are quite wide, and I think in this digital series we're actually going to talk a bit more about a lot of use cases. And Liz and I was actually talking about it, and we thought, well, let's just break it up, given that it is just so overwhelming by this sheer amount of information in order to understand in this on this particular topic, to try to compact all of that into, let's say, a half-an-hour webinar is not essentially that feasible. So why don't we then have another webinar, let's say, on the use cases, and we can actually go through that, and it could maybe be a bit more of a Q&A type session. So we will be working on that. But yeah, I hope that gives everybody a bit of a recap and a bit of a background into what you're going to be talking about next. But Liz, from your perspective, how do you see it?
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. And sorry, you just reminded me. I forgot to tell everyone, if you want to ask us questions, put them in the chat, won't you? And then what Dylan and I would do is we will get back to you after this presentation, just to kind of get it all together and then send it out as one shot. So please feel free to fill out any questions you've got in the chat section. So thanks, Dylan, for that. And I suppose really what we're saying is, and this is Liz's view, is that Bitcoin is a type of crypto asset in South Africa. It's not cryptocurrency. And why are we saying that? So we're saying that because in South Africa at the moment, Bitcoin as a crypto asset it cannot be used as legal tender like money. So, for example, banknotes, that's legal tender, and we understand that. But when we look at crypto assets and, for example, Bitcoin, no one has assumed liability for what that asset is. There's nothing backing up what that asset is. There's no bank guarantees behind a crypto asset or a Bitcoin. So having said that, then, well, what is the value of a crypto asset? And most of you know the sage of Omaha, Warren Buffett, from Berkshire Hathaway, quite my favorite old-time investor. And he says, well, if you offered me all the Bitcoin in the world for $25, I wouldn't take it. So we kind of know where Warren stands on this issue of crypto assets. But Dylan, what I want to ask you is where do you think the value of crypto assets lies?
To a large extent, for me, it depends on it's not essentially, it's not represented by like, bricks and mortar or, gold bullion or anything like that. So it's not essentially, a tangible asset. And I think this is where the volatility comes in. So it's very different from a particular currency. So you look at the rand, look at the dollar, pound, whatever the case is, it's backed by certain commodities, right? It's backed by, you've got your GDPs of the countries and the commodities. If you're looking at essentially like the crypto assets, the volatility comes in that it is sheerly based on your pure market forces of the demand for that particular crypto asset. Any particular, let's say, public statement that is made on the use case of a particular currency, or even the use of a tender of let's say Bitcoin as a tender in a particular currency could send that the value of that particular cryptocurrency either spiking really high or dipping really low. I mean, a lot of people would have
just on that. I'm sure the example that comes to mind is Tesla, isn't it?
Yes.
Where Elon Musk said, "Oh well, of course he'll accept Bitcoin as legal tender for his cars," and then changed his mind.
Yeah. And just that one statement on its own sent the price of Bitcoin spiraling. I think the important thing to also bear in mind is that when we look at the value of Bitcoin and various other crypto currencies in terms of crypto assets, it is based in a large extent in US dollar. In terms of that. So you've got a combination of forces that is essentially impacting its value. But for me, if you were to look at, if the sort of the underlying forces, if you've got Bitcoin is based on, obviously, on the Bitcoin blockchain, Ethereum based on the Ethereum blockchain, Ripple based on XRP based on the Ripple blockchain. The more use cases of that particular blockchain and cryptocurrency aside now, the more use cases of the Bitcoin blockchain that there is, you're going to have more value in that particular currency. So it depends on the actual use of the actual blockchain that is being utilized. Now, Bitcoin is a bit more widely utilized, obviously from a cryptocurrency trading aspect, but you have a bit more of private type blockchains that's coming up. And a lot more companies are, sometimes moving more towards the Ethereum or Ethereum 2, essentially, as 2.0, as they'd like to call it right now. But if we're looking at the actual value of where those sort of digital assets lie, it is very tricky. It is essentially based on, I would say, the sort of the pure market forces and the uses of that particular blockchain. If you had a particular startup on a blockchain and nobody actually utilized it, then there would be no value to that particular crypto asset at all. But the more people use it, and the more miners you have on that particular blockchain to be able to mine that information, to be able to solve those algorithms, then you'd be able to, you're going to have an increase in the value of that blockchain. But if there's nobody that's there to solve those algorithms, then there's not going to be any value of any of those transactions that you're posting in that blockchain, because there's not going to be a use case for it.
Right. Spot on.
Okay. So Liz, can crypto assets be used to pay for any sort of goods or services in South Africa as it stands right now? So obviously you mentioned a little bit earlier that right now it can't be essentially used as a legal tender. So whereas in some countries, you're looking at maybe in the South America side, you had a lot of some countries actually making it a form of legal tender that actually can be utilized, and that's also because of the sheer volatility and the devaluation of their actual own currency in itself. So they decided to adopt cryptocurrency as a legal tender. But from a South African standpoint, we know that there is no specific regulation that has been passed yet. There is obviously work papers and a draft work paper that actually has been put out by the Fintech Working Group, which the Reserve Bank is part of. But where do you see it in terms of being used to pay for goods and services in South Africa at the moment?
Yeah, and I think this is where this discussion becomes quite interesting. So a crypto asset like Bitcoin, it's not recognized in South Africa as legal tender. So those countries in the world where it is recognized as legal tender, they've obviously got a legislative framework that backs it up. But in South Africa, we're not there yet. And so yeah, can we use Bitcoin to pay for goods and services or any other form of crypto asset? Sure, we can. And we're saying this because in terms of our common law, we recognize these principles of offer and acceptance. So there's no prohibition on party B accepting crypto assets as a form of payment from party A. And generally, these crypto assets are transferred via wallets on a crypto platform. And we know that those wallets are accessed using certain pass keys or keys. And I was also having a look on, obviously, Valo, but they talk about things as hot wallets. They've got very, very cool names around what these things are. But if party B is prepared to accept the risk in the method of payment of that Bitcoin, knowing that if that payment isn't made, party B in essence has no regulatory recourse against party A. Well, that's party B's risk. And so party B's got to understand that risk and accept that risk. So if I were to look at it, take a step back and look at it, I'll say, well, crypto assets, it's not money in the strict sense that we understand it, but it's a type of barter instrument. It performs a money-like function. I'm giving you something, and in return, you're giving me a crypto asset, but I understand that it's not money per se.
I think that, to kind of maybe put that into context as well, you've got a lot of other economies and countries essentially that are developing their own form of digital currency. You have it in China, and you've got it, in Sweden. That's obviously just recently been released, and obviously and it's not a one-for-one valuation into when those digital currencies actually come out. So, the Swedish krona one Swedish krona does not necessarily equal its counterpart in terms of it's the digital currency aspect of it. But once that actually then becomes a bit more mainstream, and then you are going to be seeing it regulated just like the rand, etc., as a form of essentially legal tender, and you're going to obviously have the banks, coming in from that aspect. But one of the main risks that is associated with cryptocurrencies, and not specifically the blockchain, but with cryptocurrencies, is that due to the lack of regulation, there's a huge risk in terms of anti-money laundering from that aspect, because of the lack of regulation. And you can easily, move stuff between various exchanges. Should those exchanges be in a country that is not subject to any particular regulation? And the South African Reserve Bank, through its Fintech Working Group, is actually going to be trying to bring in the cryptocurrencies and crypto assets, potentially through our FSCA regulations, but that's still under discussion from that aspect. So, can you, from your perspective, can you send crypto assets offshore?
Yeah, so I've acquired my crypto assets in South Africa. I've bought them on a South African exchange, and let's say I've got Bitcoin, and now I want to send my Bitcoin to my kids, let's say in the UK or the US. Can I do it? And the simple answer at this stage is no, I can't. So I cannot, as a South African resident, transfer my crypto assets that I've acquired in South Africa offshore. This would be a contravention of our exchange control regulations. It's a criminal offense, because really what I'm doing is I'm exporting capital offshore. But what the Reserve Bank will allow, and this is like any other asset or investment you would want to acquire offshore, they're saying to South African residents, well, take your foreign capital allowance, which we know is 10 million, or your travel allowance of $1 million, remit those funds offshore with our consent, and then offshore you can then go and acquire those crypto assets that you want to buy. And that's okay, great. But unfortunately, what the Reserve Bank is then saying is you cannot then take those crypto assets and then transfer them back into South Africa. What you have to do then is sell those crypto assets offshore and remit those cash proceeds back into South Africa. So it's just quite an interesting take on how you can kind of invest into crypto assets. But if you're a foreign buyer, and this for me was quite fascinating, if you're a foreign buyer and you want to buy a South African business, for example, you can bring your crypto assets into South Africa, but you cannot ever transfer the cash proceeds out. So that for me is quite interesting. But again, as the seller, I would be saying to you, beware, because there's no regulation around that transaction. And so it's highly unlikely that that would occur in South Africa, given the current regulatory environment. So really, Thulin, if we have a look at where to from now, Fassam Hassani, he's the CEO of Valor, and he is quite a proponent of crypto assets and Bitcoin. He says there's no longer any room for doubt regarding the impact of crypto assets are having on our global financial system. And really, what I'd like to just kind of say is that there's got to be a balance now, which we're going to see between regulation and innovation, where the SARB, as Thulin has told us, it intends to regulate crypto assets within the next 12 to 18 months. And that regulation will be focused on crypto asset service providers per se, or CASPs, which is the acronym. And that would be regulating platforms like Valor. And this oversight is hoped will curtail things like money laundering, tax evasion, financing of terrorist activities on the one hand, but then there's this very fine balance, which is saying, well, please don't stifle innovation around crypto assets and what it could mean for the future of that sector and for our business dealings. So Thulin, perhaps, and I know we chatted about it briefly at the beginning, but if you could just give everyone a little taste of what our next webinar is going to be about.
So our next webinar, we're going to be discussing a bit more around, the use cases of various forms of crypto assets. We'll be delving a bit more into sort of smart contracts and looking at the actual working mechanisms of a smart contract. And especially when you're dealing maybe with global contracts, global transactions, what are the benefits? What are the potential disadvantages? What are the loopholes in those particular smart contracts? We talked about hacking at the very beginning in terms of a blockchain. Now, the loopholes and the risks in a particular smart contract is a smart contract is not just it's not just a physical contract that's an electronic version of that mechanism. It is based on a particular algorithm, and you would have heard potentially in the media about maybe potential smart contracts necessarily being hacked, and that's not because the blockchain was hacked. It's because there were particular fail safes that was not built into the actual algorithm of the smart contract itself. So when organizations are moving towards use cases of smart contracts, and to be fair, those are mainly dealt with maybe potentially at the moment within supply chain within the supply chain of an organization and its industries. They need to be able to really look and critically analyze the way those smart contracts are actually designed. So think about a smart contract as people developing it as I'm taking the best parts of an attorney, I'm taking the best parts of a data scientist, and I'm taking the best parts of a developer, and I'm combining them into a new individual that is going to be that is able to handle smart contracts. Because we all know as a result of all of this, we've had so many new professions that's actually that's come about because it's requiring exactly that, newer professions. And you've just said, obviously, regulation has not caught up with technology. And the same essentially applies, I think, from a workforce standpoint. Going back even a bit deeper, into sort of tertiary aspects. But I think what we're going to be doing on the next webinar is delving into smart contracts, into the working mechanisms, looking at the various use cases of cryptocurrencies, looking at the risks and the potential, and the controls, but also the benefits and opportunities. Because we always talk about risks, etc. But together with each risk, there's always still an opportunity. Yes, your return is going to be higher, and your risk is also going to essentially equate quite higher as well. But that is the nature of crypto assets, and that's the nature of trading in them. It's an inherent risk that you are essentially going to have to undertake if you want to be able to play in this space.
Thanks, Thilin. And so from Thilin and I, we'd just like to say thank you to everyone for your time this morning. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to our chat probably in a month's time. Thanks very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.